living in France is harder than you think. In 2010, the average apartment in Paris cost around $7,000 per square meter. Today, that number has climbed past $11,000, pushing homeownership out of reach for millions. Across the country, the price of basic groceries, bread, cheese, even milk, has risen by more than 25% in just 5 years, while average wages have barely moved. A small studio in central Paris now rents for over $1,300 a month, and even outside the capital, rents have surged far beyond what most workers can afford. Once, living in France meant security, elegance, and balance, a country where quality of life wasn't just a dream but a right. But in 2025, for many ordinary people, that dream feels like it's slipping away. France is still one of the wealthiest nations in the world, the 7th largest economy, home to global giants like LVMH, Total Energies, and Airbus. But beneath that surface of prosperity, something has gone wrong. The cost of living is rising faster than wages. Taxes are among the highest in Europe, and public debt has quietly passed €3.2 trillion, nearly 110% of GDP, the highest level in French history. Every day, more people find themselves working harder, only to feel poorer. The French call it le déclassement, the slow descent of the middle class. It's the feeling of slipping backward, even when you're doing everything right. Nearly 1 in 3 young adults in France still lives with their parents, not because they want to, but because they can't afford to move out. Meanwhile, the average pensioner is cutting back on food, heating, or travel, trying to stretch a fixed income in a world that's become impossibly expensive. In 2023 alone, 500,000 people took to the streets to protest against the government's plan to raise the retirement age. The anger was about more than pensions. It was about a way of life that feels increasingly under threat. Because behind every strike, every protest, and every argument in cafes or on television, there's one haunting question that refuses to go away. How did one of Europe's richest nations make life so hard for its own people? For decades, France was seen as a model of balance, a country that found a rare middle ground between capitalism and compassion. It built one of the most generous welfare systems in the world, designed to protect citizens from life's unpredictability. Free healthcare, affordable education, subsidized childcare, public pensions that promise dignity in old age. The French called it le modèle social français, the French social model. It was more than policy. It was pride, a statement that a nation could be wealthy and humane at the same time. This model was born in the aftermath of war, when France lay in ruins and the memory of hardship was still raw. The architects of modern France believed that true prosperity meant shared security. The idea was simple. The state would take care of its people, and in return, its people would take care of the state. For decades, that promise held. Through the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, France built strong industries, high employment, and a vibrant middle class. Families could buy homes, enjoy long vacations, and live with a sense of stability that much of the world envied. But stability is a fragile illusion. It works only when the foundations beneath it stay solid. As the world changed, as globalization accelerated, as technology transformed jobs, as competition intensified, the French model began to crack. What once felt sustainable slowly became a financial burden. By the early 2000s, government spending had ballooned. France was spending more than 55% of its GDP on public services, one of the highest ratios in the developed world. Generosity had become expensive. Every reform was politically dangerous. Every cut sparked outrage. And so, instead of deep reform, the system was patched and extended. More benefits, more subsidies, more debt. The illusion of stability was maintained, even as the numbers stopped adding up. Behind the scenes, the math was simple but brutal. France hasn't had a balanced budget since 1974. Every year since then, it has spent more than it earned. Every new generation has inherited the debt of the one before. The government became both protector and debtor. And as debt grew, so did dependence. For many citizens, the state became a lifeline, but also a cage. Taxes rose to fund the system, slowly choking private initiative. Businesses paid some of the highest employer contributions in Europe. Workers saw nearly half their income vanish to taxes and deductions. The paradox was clear. The very system designed to create security was now suffocating the economy that sustained it. In the short term, everything still looked fine. Paris still glittered. Cafes were still full. Tourists still came. But beneath the surface, the French miracle was running on borrowed time and borrowed money. This was the illusion of stability. A nation appearing calm on the outside while quietly sinking beneath the weight of its own promises. Because when a system becomes too expensive to maintain, it doesn't collapse overnight. It erodes slowly, paycheck by paycheck, reform by reform, protest by protest, until one day, people wake up and realize that the life they were promised no longer exists. The French system wasn't built to fail. It was built with the best of intentions, to create fairness, protection, and dignity for all. But over time, those same intentions turned into the chains that now hold the country back. Decade after decade, governments tried to fix the cracks without touching the foundation. Instead of asking why the system was breaking, they simply borrowed more to keep it running. The result is a nation caught in what economists quietly call structural stagnation. France hasn't had a balanced budget since 1974. Public debt now exceeds 110% of GDP, and each year the interest payments alone cost tens of billions, money that no longer builds schools, hospitals, or roads, but simply pays for the past. Taxes have risen to fill the gaps. Today, France has one of the highest tax burdens in the entire developed world. Nearly 47% of GDP, compared to 39% in Germany and 36% in the UK. For every euro a French worker earns, nearly half disappears into taxes, contributions, and deductions. And for businesses, hiring someone can cost almost double the person's actual salary once you include social charges. The intention was noble: fund pensions, healthcare, and social programs, but the effect has been toxic. It has strangled growth, discouraged entrepreneurship, and driven talent and investment elsewhere. For years, small businesses have complained that the system punishes risk and rewards dependency. Starting a company in France means navigating mountains of bureaucracy, rigid labor laws, and endless paperwork. And if you fail, the state offers little mercy. Meanwhile, the government remains trapped between two impossible choices: cut spending and risk riots, or keep spending and sink deeper into debt. Most choose the latter, because every reform is met with strikes, protests, and political backlash. When President Macron tried to raise the retirement age from 62 to 64, the country erupted. Millions took to the streets. Transportation shut down. Garbage piled up in Paris. It wasn't just about pensions. It was about trust. People no longer believed that reform would make their lives better. The truth is brutal but simple. France has created an economy that is both expensive and immobile. The state does too much, yet achieves too little. And the people pay too much, yet receive too little in return. The nation has fallen into an economic trap of its own design. High taxes fund a generous system. The system creates dependency. Dependency fuels spending. Spending drives debt. And debt forces higher taxes, restarting the cycle all over again. Breaking that loop would require radical change. But radical change is the one thing modern France seems incapable of. Politicians talk about reform, but every attempt collapses under the weight of resistance. From unions, from voters, from a society that still remembers when the system worked. And so France drifts. Not collapsing, but not growing either. Not impoverished, but increasingly unequal. Not broken, but undeniably stuck. This is the paradox of the French economy. Too rich to fail, too rigid to evolve. And while the government fights to preserve the illusion of balance, the human cost is quietly mounting. Every statistic tells a story. And behind every number in France's economic decline, there is a person, a family, a life, a dream slowly slipping away. The average French worker, the struggle isn't abstract. It's daily. The rent due at the end of the month. The electricity bill that keeps rising. The paycheck that seems to stretch less and less. In Paris, young professionals earning what used to be considered good salaries are now sharing small apartments to afford the rent. Teachers and nurses, the backbone of the French welfare model, are struggling to survive in the very system they help sustain. A young teacher in Lyon earns about $1,800 a month after taxes. But the average rent for a modest apartment can reach $900. Add transportation, food, and utilities. And there's almost nothing left. Owning a home? For many, it's a fantasy. Mortgage rates have soared. Housing prices have outpaced wages for more than a decade. And while the wealthy buy investment properties, millions of ordinary citizens are forced to move further and further from the cities where the jobs are. Commuting 2 hours a day is now normal, not for choice, but for survival. Students aren't doing much better. A recent study showed that nearly half of university students in France skip meals because they can afford food. The government's $1 student meal program is overwhelmed. Food banks on campuses now serve tens of thousands each week. And for those who graduate, the reward is often disappointment. A degree no longer guarantees stability. The job market is flooded, and opportunities are scarce. Many end up on short-term contracts, internships, or low-paying service jobs. The dream of la belle vie, the good life, has turned into a long struggle just to stay afloat. For the older generation, the story is different, but equally painful. After decades of work, many retirees find their pensions shrinking in real terms. Inflation has quietly eroded their spending power. Heating their homes in winter now means cutting back on food or medicine. The French social safety net still exists, but it's fraying. Healthcare, once the pride of the nation, is now under immense pressure. Hospitals face staff shortages. Doctors burn out. Appointments can take weeks, even months. The public sector, once the symbol of French stability, is tired, underfunded, and losing faith. And when the government tries to reform, the people fight back. Not just out of anger, but out of fear. Fear that one more reform will take away the little security they have left. That fear has become a national emotion. It fuels the protests that shake French cities every year. It's in the voices of workers on strike, in the chants echoing through the streets, in the graffiti that covers the walls of Paris. On veut vivre, pas survivre. We want to live, not just survive. Because for many, the French dream now feels like a luxury reserved for the few, for the executives, the landlords, the global elite who can still afford the charm of Parisian life, while millions struggle to keep up with rising prices. The working class that once built modern France is being pushed to the margins, geographically, economically, and emotionally. And as frustration grows, so does division. France is becoming two countries, one that still enjoys the old comforts of stability, and another that feels left behind in a system that no longer works for them. This is not just an economic problem, it's a human one. Because when people begin to lose faith that hard work leads to a better life, something deeper starts to break. Not just the economy, but the spirit of a nation. France has always been a country that argues, loudly, passionately, and publicly. But in recent years, those arguments have turned into something darker. Not just disagreement, but disillusionment. Not just protest, but paralysis. Politics in France has become a mirror of its economic exhaustion. Fragmented, angry, and increasingly distrustful of everyone in power. Every government promises reform. Every president pledges to fix the system. And every time the same story unfolds. Grand speeches, fierce opposition, and eventual retreat. The last decade has been one long cycle of reform and revolt. When Emmanuel Macron came to power in 2017, he was hailed as the President of Renewal. Young, centrist, pro-European. A man who claimed he would modernize France and restore its dynamism. He called himself a Jupiterian leader. Above the chaos, guiding the nation with reason and authority. But governing France has a way of humbling even the most confident. Macron's push to reform the labor market, pensions, and public spending was met with a wall of resistance. The Gilets jaunes, the yellow vests, erupted in 2018 after a planned fuel tax hike. It began as a protest against rising costs, but quickly became a rebellion against inequality and the arrogance of the elite. For months, the world watched as Paris burned, roundabouts occupied, cars overturned, riot police clashing with citizens in fluorescent vests. It was the largest grassroots movement in France in decades, and it carried a message the government couldn't ignore. People weren't just angry at one policy. They were angry at the system itself. Then came the pandemic. Lockdowns, isolation, economic strain. All of it deepened the fracture between government and governed. And when Macron returned to his reform agenda, raising the retirement age from 62 to 64, the country exploded again. Millions took to the streets. Public transport shut down. Schools, hospitals, and refineries went on strike. Even garbage collectors refused to work, and piles of trash filled the streets of Paris, a symbol of national decay. But this time, something had changed. The anger wasn't just about pensions or politics. It was about trust, or rather, the absence of it. Polls show that less than 1 in 5 French citizens now trust their government. Political parties have fragmented. Traditional powerhouses like the socialists and Republicans are shadows of what they once were. Meanwhile, populist movements on both the left and right have gained momentum, fueled by frustration, fear, and a growing sense that the system is rigged against ordinary people. Marine Le Pen's far-right national rally continues to grow, capitalizing on discontent with globalization, immigration, and the European Union. On the other side, figures like Jean-Luc Mélenchon channel anger from workers and students who feel betrayed by capitalism itself. The center, once seen as the heart of French politics, is collapsing under the weight of extremes, and that's the real danger. Not just economic stagnation, but political fragmentation. Because when people stop believing that democracy can solve their problems, they start searching for something else. Every protest, every strike, every election feels like a battle for the country's soul. Macron's reforms may one day be remembered as necessary, but right now, they're seen as proof that the system no longer listens. The divide is not just ideological, it's generational, cultural, and emotional. Old versus young, urban versus rural, elites versus the working class. It is a clash between two visions of France, one fighting to preserve a proud social model, the other desperate to reinvent it before it collapses. And somewhere in between, millions of ordinary citizens are just trying to survive, caught between ideals and reality, between reform and rebellion. This is the political chaos that defines modern France. A democracy still alive, but deeply tired. A nation that once united under revolution, now struggles to agree on what it's even fighting for. France's crisis doesn't exist in isolation. It is part of a much larger story, one that stretches across Europe and the developed world. For decades, Western economies built prosperity on a fragile foundation. Cheap credit, expanding welfare states, and the illusion of infinite growth. But that model worked only as long as populations were young, inflation was low, and globalization kept prices down. Those conditions are gone. Europe is aging. Inflation has returned, and global competition has reshaped everything, from industry to identity. France is feeling the shock most visibly, but the symptoms are spreading everywhere. In Italy, public debt is even higher. In Germany, the industrial engine of Europe is slowing, squeezed by high energy costs and global competition. In Spain, youth unemployment remains stubbornly high. Across the continent, growth has stagnated while public expectations remain sky high. People want better wages, better housing, better healthcare. Yet governments have less room than ever to deliver. France, with its powerful unions, entrenched bureaucracy, and expensive welfare model, is simply the clearest example of a European paradox. We built societies that depend on growth, and now that growth is running out. Demographics are a silent driver of this crisis. In 1950, France had nearly 5 workers for every retiree. By 2050, it will have barely 2. That imbalance is devastating. It means fewer people paying taxes, more people drawing pensions, and rising pressure on every public system, from healthcare to housing. Technology and automation were supposed to help. Instead, they've created a new divide. High-skilled jobs thrive, while low-skilled ones disappear. The middle class, the foundation of social stability, is being squeezed from both ends. Then came globalization. Factories that once provided stable jobs in France's industrial heartlands have moved to Eastern Europe, China, or North Africa. Entire towns in the north and east were hollowed out, replaced by unemployment, despair, and political anger. Meanwhile, the winners of globalization, the educated, urban, and mobile, have concentrated wealth in a handful of major cities. Paris, Lyon, Bordeaux, Marseille. These cities glitter, but the rest of the country fades quietly into economic twilight. It's no coincidence that populist movements are strongest in the places left behind. Where industry once stood, resentment now grows. And in the middle of it all stands the European Union, powerful, but constrained. Its rules limit how much France can spend or borrow, Its currency ties France's fate to that of its neighbors. And while integration has brought stability, it has also stripped nations of flexibility. France can't print its own money. It can't devalue its currency. Its budget is constantly scrutinized by Brussels. In exchange for stability, it gave up freedom. That trade-off worked when the economy was booming. But now, in an era of slow growth and rising debt, it feels like a trap. The global picture doesn't help either. Rising interest rates have made debt more expensive. The war in Ukraine has driven up energy prices, and geopolitical instability has turned Europe's old assumptions about peace and prosperity upside down. France's problems, in other words, are not just French. They are the symptoms of a global system that promised endless progress and is now running out of road. What we're witnessing isn't simply an economic slowdown. It's a transition from one era of prosperity to another, more uncertain one. For the first time in modern history, younger generations in France and across Europe may live poorer lives than their parents. That's not a political slogan. It's a historic reversal. And while every nation in Europe faces this reckoning, France's case is especially symbolic, because France was supposed to be the balance, the bridge between state power and social justice, between capitalism and care. If even France can no longer sustain that balance, what does it say about the future of Europe itself? Every crisis has its visible causes: inflation, taxes, debt. But in France, there's another layer, quieter, deeper, and far more uncomfortable. It's the way wealth has been redistributed, not through policy or politics, but through property, tourism, and globalization. On paper, France remains one of the richest nations on Earth. But in reality, that wealth has become increasingly concentrated, not among its workers, but among those who own assets, landlords, investors, corporations, and increasingly, they aren't French at all. For decades, Paris has been a magnet for global money. Luxury apartments snapped up by billionaires from London, New York, and the Gulf. Foreign funds buying entire neighborhoods through real estate companies. Short-term rentals turning once livable districts into tourist zones. In 2010, a quarter of central Paris apartments were owned by non-residents. By 2025, that share has grown even higher, pushing prices beyond what locals can ever dream of paying. The result is an invisible exodus. Teachers, nurses, young families, forced out of the capital they once called home. Some move to the outer suburbs. Others leave the region entirely, replaced by wealthy investors and a constant flow of short-term guests. The Paris housing market has become a paradox, full of homes, yet empty at night. Entire streets glow dark after sunset because their owners don't live there. And it's not just Paris. From Nice to Bordeaux to the French Alps, tourism and foreign investment have transformed entire economies. Rents in resort towns have doubled or tripled. Locals are being priced out of the very communities they built. The rise of short-term rental platforms like Airbnb has deepened the problem. In some cities, the number of tourist listings now exceeds the number of available long-term rentals. A landlord can earn in 1 week from tourists what they'd make in a month from a local tenant. The government has tried to regulate it, with taxes, caps, and registration rules, but enforcement is weak. Meanwhile, the cost of housing continues to climb, driven not by local wages, but by global demand. For foreign investors, France's charm is irresistible. Beautiful architecture, political stability, and an economy that, while slow, still offers safety in uncertainty. But for ordinary French citizens, that same stability feels like a curse, because it protects those who already have, while locking out those who don't. This is the hidden truth behind the French cost of living crisis. It's not just inflation or policy failure. It's financial colonization, the quiet takeover of local life by global capital. Tourism, too, has become a double-edged sword. It fuels nearly 8% of France's GDP and employs millions, but it also distorts local economies, making everything more expensive, from coffee to clothing to rent. In cities like Paris, Marseille, and Strasbourg, locals joke that they now feel like tourists in their own country. And for many that joke isn't funny anymore. Because the truth is simple. The French economy has become addicted to the money that makes life harder for its own citizens. Tourism brings growth, but destroys affordability. Foreign investment brings capital, but erases community. The rich bring spending, but deepen inequality. It has a system where prosperity and poverty now live side by side. The glitter of the Champs-Élysées against the struggle of the suburbs, the glamour of Bordeaux vineyards beside the debt of the workers who harvest them. This imbalance isn't new, but it's accelerating. And it's changing not just the economy, but the very identity of the country. Because France was built on the promise of equality, liberté, égalité, fraternité. But in today's France, freedom is for those who can afford it. Equality is a memory. And fraternity feels like a slogan from another age. The numbers may describe an economic crisis, but the reality describes something deeper, a nation losing its sense of who it is supposed to protect.